Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. For the second half of our show, we're joined by Angela Logomasini, CEI Senior Fellow in Environmental Risk, Regulation, and Consumer Freedom. Angela's recently published study, Beepocalypse Not, examines alarmist claims that our food supply is in danger of being wiped out by an epidemic of dead honeybees. Angela, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Angela, bees are back in the news with the recent release of the President's Pollinator Health Task Force report calling for national goals to promote the health of honeybees. This has teed up a fight between the EPA and agribusiness interests over the use of insecticides that some have accused of contributing to bee deaths. But before we get into the controversy, give us a little background on how the commercial bee pollinator business works.
Well, a lot of us think that this is simply a wildlife issue. In reality, it's a commercial issue. Bees are brought to the United States when the colonists came for honey production, and now they're used primarily for pollinating, and honey production is done around the world, mostly in other places. And so what happens every year is the beekeepers, they maintain the hives. They're domesticated, more like a crop than they are like wildlife. And they cart these bees across the country every year. 60% go out to California's almond groves. The bees do their job there, pollinating, and then they move to other places, to Washington State, to do apples and other parts of the country.
So how far do these bees travel over the interstate highway system?
They travel hundreds and hundreds of miles, probably thousands of miles in some cases, because they're carted around from one place to another. So they really embodies what a busy bee, when we think about a busy bee, is. They do a lot of work, and they do a lot of traveling.
Isn't that kind of tough on the hives?
It's one of the many stresses that bees have to deal with and that beekeepers have to deal with, and it's something they manage every year.
So trucking of European honeybees around a mega farms can hardly be called a state of nature. How long did it take this system of artificial crop pollination to evolve?
Well, the colonists started with the beekeeping for honey, and then eventually they moved it into pollination. So it's something that is just over decades has emerged, and in recent years become big business for a lot of beekeepers. There are some beekeepers that are hobby beekeepers. There are some bees in the wild, but most of them in our country are an agricultural commodity.
So what's going on with reports of increased overwinter bee deaths?
In the last couple decades, we've seen some years where beekeepers lost a lot of their hives over the winter, and that's an important measure of overall hive health. One of the phenomenons that have raised a lot of concern is something called colony collapse disorder. And this is a very specific situation where the bees leave the hive, leave the queen and honey behind, which is very peculiar. And in recent years, we've had some high losses related to colony collapse disorder. So there's been a lot of focus on that. But ultimately, the real issue for honeybees is their overall health. And that is something that is being monitored, and researchers are working to resolve a whole host of problems that stress honeybees and lead to hive health challenges.
How do the beekeepers replace the dead bees, come the next spring?
What they do is, there's a number of ways. They can split their hives and get a new queen and eventually multiply and get back to their regular numbers. Of course, that is not a perfect solution, but it takes time. They can also order bees. Again, it's a commercial industry. You can order a new hive and replenish that way. Of course, there are lots of challenges associated with that in terms of genetic diversity of your bees and things of that nature. All these things have an impact. And really, there's a whole science behind beekeeping that beekeepers have got to pay attention to. And it's always evolving, improving, and new challenges emerging.
Environmental activists have placed the blame for a lot of these bee deaths on a class of insecticides called Neonicotinoids, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, or neonics. What are neonics?
These are what you call systemic pesticides, and you can get them at your local garden store. You apply them to the plant, or they're applied for agriculture. Most of them are applied to the seed. So when the plant grows and a insect that bites the plant, that seed has created a tree or a plant that is poisonous to that plant, or at least unpalatable. So you end up targeting those bugs that are biting the plant and causing problems. The reason we went to neonicotinoids from other things where you spray was there's a lot less environmental impact. So you're not spraying when the butterflies come and when the bees come. It's really targeted toward the ones that are a problem. Now, environmentalists say it gets in the pollen and it appears in the hives, but the data show that it's really tiny. And I've talked to beekeepers, and they've told me that at least one of the largest beekeepers in the country told me that it's the best thing they've seen since they've been in the business for in decades, because the impact is so much lower. But it is being blamed because I believe it's in widespread use, and people like to focus on the big business, so they go after the one that's the most popular.
What do peer-reviewed toxicity studies tell us about neonics?
Actually, the really relevant studies, there are field studies. When bees are foraging out in the field in real conditions, there's no effect. There are lab studies where they poison the bees. They literally feed it to them in a sugar solution, which is not the best, also the best dietary solution for a bee. And the bees don't do well. Well, if you poison a bee, with a high level of a chemical, and you try to simulate something that you can't really simulate what's actually in reality, bees do have a problem, and they call it sublethal effects. They say the bees, have a low-level exposure that makes them weaker.
Weirds them out.
But in reality, the weakness has to do with a lot of other factors, and there's not a lot of evidence or correlation between bees where they're used, where these products are used, and where there are problems. For instance, in places like Australia, they use neonics. They don't have colony collapse disorder, and the bees are doing okay. They have other challenges, which we can talk about, but the neonics are not the biggest challenge.
When dead honeybees are analyzed or collapsed hives are dissected, are they found to be loaded with neonics?
No. In fact, the number of studies that are out there, there was one that looked at all the different things in the hive. The big things in the hive that are problems are pathogens sent by Mother Nature. And then the second level would be pesticides that beekeepers themselves use in the hive. And they have to use these pesticides in the hive, because if they don't, the bees will die from other diseases that those products control. They're not neonicotinoids. They're designed specifically to be used in the hive. And there is potentially some stress from that, obviously, if you're using that much in there. And when they measure it out, they're thousands of times higher than very small traces of neonics that are found that are really rather insignificant.
Well, what are these other pathogens that are in the hives? There seem to be a lot of reports of mites that have infested the beehives. Yes.
In the last couple decades, the Varroa destructor, they call it. It's actually a little mite, believe it or not, just like a tick that would be on your dog. It's a little mite that's on the honeybee and other bees, and it makes them sick. It transmits diseases, and it's a huge problem for bees. It's a problem in places like Australia, where they don't seem to have any problem with the neonics. Obvious correlations, but they do have that. Starting to travel around the world. It's a big problem here in the U.S. It's been a problem in Europe. But the good news is we're starting to get it under control, or we're seeing it getting under control. For example, in Europe, the numbers for overwinter survival were really quite good this year. The last studies. It's before the neonics were banned there. So the last year, while they were using the neonics, the bees have really done much better. They've done better overwintering in the U.S. However, in the last study from the Bee Informed Initiative, which is a research initiative on this topic, the bees didn't do as well in the summer. So people are really focused on that now, and they haven't measured that consistently. So it's important to start looking at that and figuring out what's going on so that they can resolve whatever issues are going on there.
Well, what does the historical record tell us about honeybee populations in the U.S.? Have there been problems with unusual bee deaths before?
Yes, there's been the mysterious colony collapse disorder, dating back into the 1800s, and periodic events. Today, the beekeeping industry is vastly different than it was, 100 years ago. It is big business. It has become more consolidated. You've got a lot of big beekeepers. So if there are problems, diseases emerge, it may be more severe, but at the same time, we have better technology, so we're figuring it out. So we've had these kind of occurrences, but being that the industry is different now, we have to come up with different solutions.
And there's no risk of honeybees going extinct anytime soon?
No, absolutely not. There's a lot of focus on, this honeybee population issue, and environmental groups will point out that there are fewer hives in the U.S. than there were 50 years ago, and that is true. The reality is honey production, with the reduction of honey subsidies, a lot of it's moved overseas. So there are more hives globally around the world, and honey production is maybe bigger than pollination. It's an important service that the bees provide, so it's a big industry as well. So globally, there are more hives than than ever before. But there are less in the U.S. than there were 50 years ago. The last few years, we have a little bit more. So in the last 5 years, we actually ticked up a little bit. But it's the ebb and flow of market forces. That's where the bees are going. It's just like if you had cattle. Argentina makes great beef. They have more cattle there. But, if they stopped making beef or there was no market for it, they'd have fewer.
So, Angela, I downloaded this 64-page task force report from the president's office with a national strategy to promote the health of honeybees and other pollinators. And I was really struck with the number of agencies involved. I just got to read you this list. Here are all the federal agencies that are working on honeybees. The Council on Environmental Quality, the Department of Defense, the Department of Education, the Department of Energy, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of the Interior, the Department of State, the Department of Transportation, the Domestic Policy Council, the General Services Administration, the National Science Foundation, the National Security Council, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. We had fewer agencies involved in sending a man to the moon than we are looking at beehives. What's going on here?
Okay, well, what we're seeing is a response more to alarmism and a political statement more than a solution. The federal government has been involved in research, the Bee Informed Initiative. There have been things that have produced good information and helped beekeepers improve their operations. But this is more of a political statement. They want to spend $80 million on a whole host of things, from pork barrel to handouts. This is how I view it, to a lot of beekeepers, a whole host of other things, government gardens and so forth. And the reality is the federal government really is not going to be the real source of the solution. It's going to come from the private sector.
Are we going to put beekeepers on the dole the way we have corn farmers?
Maybe. Every time there's some sort of crisis, somebody has their hand out and says, help me. Back when there was the West Nile virus and the state of New York sprayed to control really deadly disease-carrying mosquitoes, lobster farmers blamed it on the government, and they got a lot of payouts, even though there was no evidence that the pesticides affected the lobsters. No solid evidence. So that's just a standard course, I guess, unfortunately. But I will note there is something the federal government could do, and that is they could stop destroying habitat, which is what they do with the federal renewable fuel standard. You're planting so much corn to meet that standard, far more acreage than Obama administration's plan wants to improve for the honeybees, far more, and yet they continue that program and they want to expand it.
Preparing for this interview, I spent way more time than I wanted to trying to garner some insight from Googling up articles on bee deaths, and there's so much conflicting information and misinformation out there that it's really almost impossible for a layman to reach an informed opinion. Why can't we leave this to the beekeepers, the farmers, and the markets to work out? Why do we need a national policy? If you're a beekeeper and you really believe neonics are killing your bees, why don't you just stop renting them out to farmers that use neonics?
Actually, the irony is I think the beekeepers that are doing a lot of the renting out are not the ones that are complaining. A lot of it's hobbyists. They're reading the news, and they're genuinely concerned. They, like you said, there's so much misinformation out there that they want to say, hey, do something about it, ban these chemicals. And then they say they migrate and all this stuff. So it is very difficult to get a handle on that. I think it's really driven by activist groups. But if you read long enough and you look hard enough, really the answers start to emerge, and they're pretty clear. There's diseases that have to be addressed, or a whole host of the stresses associated with transport of bees, also better hive management. If you're a hobbyist, it's a lot of work to figure out how to control these pests and stuff, and the resources are more limited. So it's out there. You just really have to dig for it.
Is this just another proxy war between environmentalists and agribusinesses?
I do think so it is. The bee is a perfect symbol. The busy bee, people think this is the battle against nature. And in reality, as I pointed out, this is a business. It's an agricultural commodity. Certainly, the impact that farming and beekeeping has on our native species is important. That is something that should be researched and carefully monitored. And people who care can plant things to create a better diet for the bees. The reality is that's their biggest challenge is habitat loss. And we can do something. As individuals, farmers can work in their communities with the beekeepers to plant things that are good for the honeybees. It doesn't have to be an $80 million government program with posters and dinner parties and, exhibits at museums and stuff. It can be really pretty basic.
You mentioned that something like 3/4 of the country's pollinator bees get trucked out to California to pollinate almond trees. Aren't these the same trees that are sucking up so much of California's water?
Yeah, that's a whole other issue. There are a lot of governmental created problems in agriculture, whether it's water subsidies for the wrong uses or ethanol subsidies that make it hard for farmers to create wildlife habitat because, you know what, there's an incentive to grow more corn if you're going to make more money.
Mm.
So those perverse incentives are things that we definitely should be looking at and trying to figure out how to get rid of them instead of trying to spend more taxpayer dollars for more programs to fix problems that the government created in the first place.
Neonics have been banned in many parts of Europe. If there's only a 1% chance that those insecticides might be harming bees, why shouldn't we play it safe like the Europeans and ban them here?
Because what happens is you ban one product, farmers still need to farm, they go back, they get another product, and the products that they're going for, they're spraying. So the bees are going to be at a bigger risk, and that's a real concern. And I think if I was a beekeeper, I'd be more concerned about that because that's why we switched from the sprays to reduce the environmental impact. We need to use technology to make food, and there's been a lot of crop damage in Europe in the first year that they had that ban.
Was there?
Probably a lot more pesticide use as a result. And that's, we got to make food. We got to make it affordably. So we need to really be targeted and use our technologies properly.
Well, wouldn't organic farming solve a lot of these problems?
Well, we wouldn't be able to feed everybody. That's why they use these products. High-yield farming means more food per acre. It means a whole host of technologies from genetic modification to targeted uses of pesticides. Maybe there are some things that can be organically farmed, and that can be part of the solution. But once you mandate that, you're going to have problems. And even organic farming isn't pesticide-free. They just use different pesticides. So we need to think strategically. If you produce less food per acre, that's less land for wildlife. So we have to have the big picture in mind and let people use the tools that they can.
I mean, it's been real curious trying to sort this issue out. And a lot of the alarmist literature I've read is devoted to accusing producers of neonics of following a tobacco industry strategy of denial, suspicious science, and political lobbying to keep politicians from banning their products. How do you respond to that?
Well, I see that argument made for every policy debate they disagree with. So you got to look at the facts. Don't look at the accusations. Look at the facts, research it, and figure out who's being straight here. So I think it's all about finding the right balance, recognizing that the concern about bees is a legitimate one. Concern about the impact on non-target or native wildlife is a very important one. I'm a wildlife gardener. I don't want to see, all my butterflies and bumblebees disappear either. So you got to be educated, but also be critical in what you read.
Can't markets just adjust to the changing price of bee pollinator services?
They do. When the beekeepers are having a hard time, they have to charge a little bit more.
Sure.
So, and actually, all the alarmism may enable them to charge more than maybe they need to, just because there's a perception, right? So, that markets they're going to respond.
So it could be in their interest to create a lot of alarmism because it gets them to jack up their prices.
Some of them, yes, perhaps.
So, Angela, what practical solutions are being recommended to help reduce overwinter bee deaths?
Despite the big government approach that's happening in Washington, these solutions are ultimately going to come at the local level, and they already are coming. Beekeepers are working with researchers at the universities. They're learning. They're getting better tools in their arsenal. They're learning how to manage the mites, improve the health, technology. Even though environmentalists don't like it, even big business is involved. Their crop science is providing a lot of money toward research. Syngenta is providing a lot of habitat assistance to try to create the habitat. Nutrition's a huge part of the program. And then the average homeowner, you don't have to have all grass in your property. It might be easier to just have some wildflowers and provide that diverse diet. I really think habitat loss is a huge part of it. And then the federal government's going to do something. It needs to look in the mirror and see where it's doing damage with ethanol subsidies and other things, water subsidies or whatever it is, and get those things out of the way so that people can develop the right solutions.
Are you willing to predict that in 5 or 10 years we're going to have moved on to some other controversy and people forget arguing about bees?
It depends. It depends how much success the environmentalists have in their fundraising and their alarmism. The government pollinator report says we need to get to the point where we only have a 15% overwinter loss. That's lower than what beekeepers consider natural and acceptable for their industry.
Where'd that number come from?
They made it up. And so what ends up happening is every year is going to be a crisis, because if you set the goal unrealistically, it's going to look like we've got a problem. So that's one way of them keeping the issue alive. But hopefully we'll start finding solutions that'll help mitigate the alarmism, and they'll move on to the next issue.
What do you recommend interested laymen do to learn more about this?
Well, I have a website, safechemicalpolicy.com. I have a page on bees. You can also go to the different websites where there's research, the Bee Informed Initiative. They have a site in Europe where they put out an annual report on bee health. But for the average person, I try to put something together that's a fact, fiction provision on my website, plus the links out to all the really legitimate research that people need to look at. And there are some really good websites. Scientific Beekeeping is by a beekeeper who does a really great job. So I would look to some of those beekeepers. They have really good information, even on their blogs, that are being thoughtful about the issue.
Well, Angela, thanks for coming on and sharing with us today.
Thank you.
That was Angela Logomasini, CEI Senior Fellow in Environmental Risk, Regulation, and Consumer Freedom, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. If you'd like to help us expand, please stop by realclearradio.org and hit the donate button, or contact us to become a corporate supporter. That wraps up our show for this week. Join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.